Hi, Fiona Boyd here, U.S. Director of Acuity Commodities. Joining me today is Justin Mize, Senior Market Analyst. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to our first podcast in this format. Depending on your feedback, we may keep it going.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I really hope we can continue further episodes in the future, especially if the feedback's good on these. So just kind of giving some background on ourselves and a little bit about the company. Do you want to kind of set the stage a little bit from kind of your role here at Acuity as a U.S. director?
Sure. So I have been covering the global sulfur and sulfuric acid markets with a specialized focus on North America since 2008. I have worked at a few price reporting agencies before co-founding Acuity Commodities with Fred Gordon in 2016. So next year we're going to be 10 years old. And my role at Acuity is to oversee all of our content. We publish 2 weekly global reports, one on sulfur, one on sulfuric acid, a regional report on Southern Africa, a regional North American report on sulfuric acid, an industrial chemicals report for North America, which you are the editor for, as well as our Insight database of battery and mining projects in North America, which you, Justin, also maintain. And then we do a lot of consulting work, speaking at conferences. So that's kind of our overview.
Right on. Then kind of looking into a little bit of my kind of day-to-day here. I've been with Acuity as a market analyst for nearly 4 years here, which has been quite a great ride ever since I've been on. And like Fiona mentioned, really been focusing on kind of 2 of our main core products, the industrial chemicals in the US and Canada, where it's kind of a monthly market briefing of caustic soda, hydrochloric acid, chlorine, ammonia, and of course our bread and butter, sulfur and sulfuric acid. And the second kind of offering that I've also helped develop was that Insight, US and Canada battery and mining projects and database, which I know is a bit of a mouthful. So I will try to refer to that as Insight throughout the rest of the podcast moving forward here. But this offering really kind of, it serves as a good use case for kind of bridging the gap between the chemical commodity industry and suppliers and the battery material sector. It's looking at, projects that are looking at, coming online or under evaluation, and looking to consume or produce chemical commodities, especially the ones that we cover. And now the database actually has over 100 projects in North America included into it. And the list keeps growing each quarter, which is super exciting to see. And the most common use case for it is really for, chemical commodity suppliers that are really just looking for new opportunities and trying to monitor potential new projects as they're coming online.
Awesome. So we're just easing into summer. We have some industry events coming up, such as Southwest Fertilizer Conference in July. Are you ready for Nashville, Justin?
I'm so much looking forward to Nashville. It's always a really great conference. Looking forward to very busy conference, back-to-back meetings, which makes the time go by much quicker. And it's always good to kind of see a lot of, familiar faces all in one conference at this time of year. So, super excited to go out to it. But before we reach Southwestern Fertilizer Conference, we will be at the Fast Markets Conference in Las Vegas, in less than 2 weeks here, actually, as of the recording of this, at least. So we're looking forward to, again, kind of bridging the gap between the chemical commodity sector that we're in and the battery material sector for this conference, and, kind of shedding some light on our chemical markets that we cover, with industry participants in the battery material sector, and vice versa, right? Learning from them about, kind of the new projects that are coming online too. So very much looking forward to that. It'll be our first time sponsoring and attending. So, not really sure what to expect, but I'm really happy to be going.
Awesome. So Vegas to Nashville sounds like a good time. So in the meantime, there's a few notable things going on in the markets we cover and developments on the horizon. So today we're just going to chat about those issues, including current market conditions and what could lie ahead.
Right on. What market would you like to get started with?
I say sulfur because it's the one we're being asked about the most these days.
Absolutely. After the last spike in the second quarter Tampa contract price, taking it to its current $270 per long ton delivered, the highest since the third quarter of 2022. A lot of folks are wondering what could be on the horizon, maybe for third quarter.
Sure. So our most recent U.S. Gulf Coast assessment as of last week was 275 to 280 a ton FOB, which would imply a slight increase from the 270. This is because refiners look to this export pricing as their alternative to supplying the domestic molten market. So as such, they want those numbers to align. Around 900,000 tons a year are exported from the U.S. Gulf Coast. So it's not, just a negligible volume. But at the same time, we're seeing an cooling in global prices. We're seeing that right now at the time of recording. So as we get closer to July, the U.S. Gulf Coast price assessment is key to watch, as that will influence negotiations. So if that global pressure downward pressure sustains this month, which we're showing signs that it will, the U.S. Gulf Coast price will ease along with it. So the downward pressure we are seeing now is mainly due to weaker import interest from China and Indonesia. And those are arguably the two countries that led the most recent bull run that began in February.
Very good insight. I'm sure that the next issue of Regional Briefing US and Canada, that'll be published on June 16th. Correct. For the next edition. We'll have the full update on kind of where things stand and really what to expect for North American sulfur. But how about sulfuric acid?
As for acid, domestically, the market is overall balanced, and we're not hearing any major supply or demand issues. So the market's well supplied. Demand overall is okay, but I say the West is best because demand for mining there is strong. And at the same time, some of the regional smelters that supply that region aren't running at optimal levels. So that's really constraining supply. In the U.S. Southeast, things are not as robust. We keep seeing pulp and paper mill closures there.
The hits definitely keep coming for the U.S. pulp and paper industry. And the most recent mill closure that we reported in Georgia basically plans to wind down operations before August of this year. So before that, even, we've seen 10 mill closures at least in North America since 2023, and many located in the U.S. Southeast region, states like Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And at the same time, we've kind of seen a little bit more supply availability on the sulfuric acid side for that same region. So what do you think about that?
Well, and then we have that new demand, right, for battery recycling that's kind of being delayed. So we were expecting to see maybe some projects in Georgia or Kentucky start up sooner than expected that, have not come to fruition. So that's, we're seeing declining demand from pulp and paper, potential increase, but it's not coming to fruition. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot of battery recycling projects out there, some of which have come online since 2022, others of which were slated to, but didn't and are on pause or got delayed or were over budget. So we're kind of taking a look at those all within kind of our insight briefing, which tracks those projects. And as you mentioned, a lot of those being in the Southeast US, but also in Nevada and New York and in Quebec as well. So, just kind of tracking, how far along within, maybe the construction phase a lot of these projects are in, and, maybe face, if they do face further delays or some that plan to come online as soon as this year. So it's kind of, it just varies with the landscape right now. And I think we've seen this varying, challenging outlays of these projects really due to the battery materials, kind of pricing decline that we've seen really since 2023. And that includes, the battery materials like lithium and cobalt and some of the base metals.
And all of that's really being driven by a slower uptick of electric vehicles than anticipated, correct? So
right.
As we've seen the adoption of EVs in the U.S. not be to where it may be in other markets, such as China, let's say, all these kind of downstream and even upstream projects have kind of stalled along with it.
I totally agree with that. You've really seen kind of a change in strategy with the, domestic automotive manufacturers. You've seen a lot of phasing out of what was going to be new electric vehicle capacity. And going back to either internal combustion engines or, hybrid vehicles, which still will use batteries to some degrees. So, you've just seen a bit of a changing landscape and demand not coming as soon as, these automotive manufacturers kind of originally anticipated. So might be slowing down a little bit of the markets there. But, again, as we kind of attend more of these conferences in the battery materials sector, each one we attend, it's kind of, it seems to be a story of, it's not if, but when these battery materials markets will kind of revive and come back. So we'll just kind of continue to monitor that, as we attend the conferences and keep an eye on the industry as a whole, and obviously keep those updated, as subscribers for the Insight offering. And the other thing I want to mention there is that we do assess each project on a probability and timing index, which basically gives a confidence score for, the project's outlay. And, if it's especially useful for these projects that may be, delayed, behind schedule, or over budget and things like this, so that you kind of know, like, okay, maybe this project might be a little bit closer to actual commercial quantities than another. And that's just, something that's provided within that kind of Insight database.
Got it. And going back to the West, it's a little bit, we talked about kind of the slowing stuff in the Southeast. Things are picking up a little bit more in the West for mining, right? And for merchant sulfuric acid. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at mining projects that will consume merchant acid, sulfuric acid, in our Insight database offering, clients can basically go in and filter for these standards. But looking at Arizona alone, if we filter for those projects that are above 80% on our probability and timing index, which basically means a construction phase, we see 2 copper mining projects that pop up under construction right now, and both remain on target for first cathode production as soon as this year. So coming up pretty quickly here. And, sulfuric acid consumption volumes are sort of noted in that database respectively for each project. Awesome. And that new demand will kind of continue to support sulfuric acid in that region. As you would say, the West is best. So, and even as those projects start to ramp up after first production, that will just continue to feed into that demand.
Yeah. And of course, there is some potential new sulfur demand out West, right? I mean, mainly for the new 2 mining lithium projects in Nevada. But tell the listeners about what else is on our radar outside of those 2 well-known projects.
Absolutely. That's a really great region to take a look at. To your point, I think a lot of participants really focus on those 2 specific lithium developments, but there are many more, developments for leaching operations or potential new leaching operations. And it's in the lithium space, but it's also, in the copper and, other base metal space, right? So I don't think that's focused on enough. But these new kind of leaching projects, are always evaluating their own sulfur-based sulfuric acid plants to produce their own sulfuric acid for leaching, which obviously has potential for a huge sulfur component there. So, with this big demand for captive acid, it could be in cobalt, it could be in lithium, nickel, whatever the application. I think it's really going to drive that market if we start to see some of these projects really come online.
Mm-hmm. And that potential new sulfur demand, is it occurring at a time when the U.S. production is declining? I mean, this year we're going to lose 300,000 tons alone from 2 refinery closures. We're going into next year with a potential additional refinery closure early in the year. So on paper, even though the U.S. market is balanced in terms of how much we produce and consume, it's these solid exports from the Gulf Coast and the West Coast that result in the supply deficit. And there's logistical constraints. So it's not as simple as it sounds to just flip a switch and stop that sulfur from going offshore and staying onshore inland. So as we move forward, how that U.S. demand is going to be covered is a key topic of conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. That molten sulfur market here is definitely complex, and it'll be even more interesting to see if, some of these leaching projects do come online, if it, feeds into that complexity there. Mm-hmm. So I think that does a good job of kind of wrapping up the landscape there, especially in the West. But any final thoughts on kind of the sulfur and acid markets?
Sure. Just noting we're kind of seeing a different trend in acid pricing right now than we're seeing for sulfur pricing. Acid pricing has increased in the past couple of weeks, mainly by a buying spree for Morocco, which really soaked up any availability out of the key export regions of Asia and Europe. So as with sulfur, the U.S. is a deficit market for acid. We rely on imports from Canada, Mexico, Asia, Europe, to the tune of 3 million tons last year. So a significant volume. So that means that this U.S. import pricing needs to be passed on. So with that, and then the kind of recent higher sulfur pricing that we've been seeing, that's been providing some price support.
That makes me think of tariffs.
No, not the T word. I'm not going to make any speculation there because, as we've seen, it's very quickly changing. Something else could change by the time we get finished recording this. So right now we continue to be in the 90-day pause, until July 9th, and then we'll see what comes. So wrapping up on sulfur and acid, global markets are firm, but sulfur is showing some weakness. The Tampa 3Q price is, of course, highly awaited. So keep watching that U.S. Gulf Coast price as we move closer to July. We'll, of course, report any developments in a timely fashion regarding a settlement. For acid, domestic markets balance, but global prices running up, and the potential for any supply disruptions domestically could easily shift the market.
Nicely explained. Thanks for the insight, Fiona.
Thank you. So what about you, Justin? What's going on in your world? Where do you want to start? Caustic? Ammonia?
I think probably ammonia because of the most recent news from last week's June Tampa contract settlement.
A little delayed.
A little bit delayed there. I think it took a little bit of time to come to terms on both sides. But we finally got a settlement price last week at $392 per CFR, per ton CFR. And that was a $23 per ton decrease, which was, I think, the 6th consecutive decline of ammonia pricing since December of 2024. So at the same time that you saw the increase of the Tampa sulfur contract price in the second quarter, we've seen ammonia values come down domestically. And it is sort of worth mentioning that, we're kind of at the end of the fertilizer application season here in the U.S. So the ammonia market is coming to a bit of a summer lull. And there's this anticipation of new capacity to come online in the U.S. Gulf Coast, basically over 2 million tons per year that will come online or is scheduled to commission by the end of this year. So I think participants are awaiting what's going to happen there, and we'll continue to report kind of new developments in that new capacity and, when that's slated to come on in our Industrial Chemicals U.S. and Canada brief.
Awesome. Caustic?
Yeah, so in caustic soda, we saw a price increase announcement made by a major domestic producer. from May 28th for $30 per dry short ton in the US and $46 per dry metric ton in Canada. And we've already seen kind of a lot of pushback on this increase just because there's a lot of signs of market balance and kind of inventory builds for the domestic system, especially. So we're coming off the back of kind of the chlor-alkali maintenance season, where more production's been coming online. We're getting into, what is typically kind of a higher season for construction and PVC markets, which also drives operating rates up, and kind of increases the availability of that byproduct caustic soda along with it. We also saw force majeure lifted last month and kind of clearing up of some various short-lived operational issues. So we're in a little bit more comfortable place with availability, I think. And as you mentioned, for the pulp and paper sector with the mill closures, and its impact on sulfuric acid demand, the same is true for caustic soda demand, right? Since both, sulfuric acid and caustic soda are key inputs for those pulp and paper mills. So that's another kind of industry that we're continuing to watch. And I should also mention that for kind of upcoming new demand in caustic soda for the US and Canada, that's something that we're also tracking within the Insight database, and at least 70 planned projects are anticipating to utilize caustic soda to some degree, right? And those estimates are, typically stated within the database where possible. If it's too early for projects to really get a good estimation, then, that estimate can be unknown. But for the most part, those estimates are there for, closer projects coming to production sooner. And I think it just goes to show, how many applications caustic soda really can have, and especially for the battery and mining sector for pH regulation. So these will be really key to watch with just the huge potential that it could have for the US and Canada for demand.
Wrapping it up with hydrochloric, what's on the radar there?
Yeah, so hydrochloric, or the HCl market, as I usually call it in short, we kind of really just have our eyes on some drilling indicators right now, since the rest of the market's really quiet.
Because the weaker oil prices aren't supporting drilling, right? Which is... There's
absolutely
a lot of use of HCl there.
So for those oil well acidizing applications, we're kind of just seeing, reduced frac counts and higher drilled but uncompleted well inventories and lower rig counts. So I think that's something that we're going to try to continue to watch, especially, since the spark of, kind of that lower oil pricing environment that we saw, which was probably really a result of, some expectations on, reduced global oil consumption and expectations for higher output from OPEC plus, and, even some trade and tariff uncertainties there. So we'll continue to take a look at this, but at the same time, we've got the onset of the water treatment demand.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there anything that can offset this weaker demand from...
And I think the water treatment really would do that.
And I think, acid market's been waiting for that too, right? To give a little seasonal uptick in demand to kind of help it feel less sluggish.
And hydrochloric acid and sulfuric acid are very similar in those ways, right? They have kind of their industrial applications and their water treatment, right? But also worth noting on hydrochloric acid is that it's used as a leaching reagent as well as sulfuric acid, right? So we also track this commodity in our Insight offering for how it's going to be used in the battery and mining sector. And there's just a lot of potential there for, reagent applications and mining and battery materials sectors. So as of now, our Insight database contains 49 projects in North America that plan to utilize HCl in one way or another. Again, with yearly quantities estimated where we can apply that and where possible. And I think that pretty much wraps it up for me.
Awesome. Just kind of a final thought, because I know it's something we get asked about or is, discussed in the market, is changing battery chemistries, right? or changing mining applications, and anything like that could shift the demand for these raw materials or reagents, is something that's often discussed. So, for example, right now in China, we're seeing increased production of lithium iron phosphate batteries, or LFPs as they're called. China increased their production of LFPs over 50% last year. What's interesting about those batteries is they don't use cobalt or nickel. So that's, having a knock-on effect there. So, we see kind of these changes, and what thoughts do you have on that as far as its impact?
Yeah, the changing kind of cathode and anode mix is always something to watch. And I think a good point to bring up would be the lithium sulfur battery developments and how that has some potential for some new adoption. Like you mentioned with the LFP batteries, right? We saw that as a very kind of fast changing dynamic, especially in Asia. And kind of now we could see a similar thing going on with the lithium sulfur. And, you see, like, for example, in the domestic, US, we saw an announcement for a large gigafactory for lithium sulfur batteries in Nevada announced, and it plans to break ground for construction this year. So we've also seen automotive manufacturers of electric vehicles kind of partner with some of these lithium sulfur, battery makers to, see if there's any potential to unload these batteries for uses in EVs, which would be huge for the lithium sulfur battery adoption. And, EVs were really the main driver behind China's adoption of the LFPs. Right. So if we see that start to go, then that could be key to watch for the sulfur market, especially to be used, not just for leaching, for sulfuric acid uses, but, for actual battery production.
Thanks for that. Obviously, there's a lot changing. There's a lot on the radar. But, that's where Acuity steps in and can help provide some clarity. Thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss the commodity markets that we cover. We are attending and sponsoring the Fast Markets Lithium Supply Chain and Battery Raw Materials Conference later this month in Las Vegas. Next month, we will be attending and exhibiting at the Southwest Fertilizer Conference. We hope to see you there.
Thanks. And thanks again for having me on, Fiona. I had a really good time on the podcast, and I hope we can continue this further for future episodes. If you would like more information about Acuity's products and services, or you're interested in meeting with us at, the conferences that we have upcoming for Fast Markets or Southwestern Fertilizer Conference, please shoot us an email at info@acuitycommodities.com, or you can visit our website for more information about our offerings, www.acuitycommodities.com.
Thanks, Justin. We hope this is the first of many Acuity Podcast episodes, and we look forward to your feedback.